My name is Matthew Kane, and this is the Dirty Air F1 podcast.
Oh, yellow where you are. Watch for debris. Yeah.
I got sprayed with all kind of fucking shit. It's gonna be
Okay, Kimi, your safety car window is closed. Safety car, mode C, and work on your brakes and tires. And there is a lot of debris on the track.
I know, because it just happened fucking 50
I know.
My car is full of shit.
Oh no, we are checking the tire.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm with you. Don't worry, we're checking.
I thought it was wise, before we get into some serious debate here, that we started off with a bit of humor thanks to Kimi. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Dirty Air F1 podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kane. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is part 2 of my review for the Grand Prix at Imola, and specifically the incident between Valtteri Bottas and George Russell. In hindsight, I'm certainly glad that I did not record this episode on the eve of the Grand Prix, because I was certainly looking at it from one perspective, and that would have been from George Russell's. But age has given me much, my friends. I have wisdom. I actually recently held a poll on Twitter as to who they felt was responsible for the incident. I gave them the option Valtteri Bottas, George Russell, or racing incident. And I can tell you what, that the poll was actually very surprising to me. Valtteri Bottas received 26% of the vote. George Russell, 31% of the vote. And racing incident, 43% of 61 people voting. Now, I learned a few things about this. First off, I never would have expected Russell to have been higher than Bottas. And number 2, I think there was a lot more involved than just those 3 options. So if you'd be kind enough to listen in, I'd like to explain it to you. Going back to my 2021 prediction podcast, I had mentioned that Valtteri Bottas was one of my drivers that I'd put on the hot seat this year. And after having taken the time to analyze this incident, you know what? I think Valtteri Bottas' fate at Mercedes is already sealed. And I think that for that very reason, I can describe in detail exactly what just happened in this past race for Valtteri Bottas.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth! You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline.
Honor, code, loyalty. Still with me? Yes, I've gone way down the rabbit hole this week. And what I'd like to do is describe to you exactly the process that I went through to form these opinions. I'm assuming that you've already formed your opinion about the incident. It's either Russell's fault, Bottas's fault, or a combination of both. And this week you may have been thinking to yourself, Matt, seriously, get over it. It's pretty easy to see. Why is this episode so hard to do? Why is it taking so long?
You have the luxury of not knowing what I know.
The more time I spent diving into this subject, I ended up looking for more evidence. Then I found more evidence. And then I looked at it from a different perspective and found evidence on that way. It's been quite a week, and I really hope that you enjoyed my perspective, and I'm certainly looking forward to your comments below. So let's get back to those 3 main points: honor, code, and loyalty. I think if we take a look at every single person that's actually involved in this situation and we analyze honor, code, and loyalty, it'll help us discover a motive, possible intent, and fault. I think it'll also explain these people's actions since the accident has occurred. To fully understand this situation, we must take a look at how things got to this point. So without further ado, ladies and
gentlemen, a short view back to the past.
In 2016, Mercedes not only won the F1 Constructors title, but also the F1 Drivers title with their champion, Nico Rosburg. On paper, they looked like the most successful team in the sport. But behind garage doors, all was not well. Tensions were high. The team was exhausted. The battle between Rosburg and Hamilton took everything out of them. Toto Wolff and team management were certainly struggling, trying to find a balance between their 2 superstar drivers. And as a fan of F1, I was trying to find balance as well. I mean, I didn't really like the type of driving that was going on between those 2 drivers at Mercedes at the time. But I was grateful that there was competition because the car was so far out in front. Questions loomed for the team going into the off-season. What changes would they have to make to settle this feud? The once childhood best friends were now mortal enemies. Luckily for Mercedes, they wouldn't have to figure out this problem, as only days after he won the championship, Nico Rosburg retired. Mercedes were caught completely off guard. Although no doubt relieved, now they had an entirely different problem on their hands. Who was going to fill the next seat beside Lewis Hamilton? Big names like Alonso were already tied into contracts. Luckily for Toto, he had a known commodity in his back pocket. Enter Valtteri Bottas. Bottas had impressed many people in the ill-handling Williams, and certainly performed well against Felipe Massa. I remember it was one qualifying performance in Sochi that put him on everybody's F1 radar. People were starting to question how good he could be if he was actually in a better car, much like we hear today when people talk about Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, or George Russell. On paper, it looked like a no-brainer. Valtteri was low drama, low salary, obviously quick. Didn't expect him to be as fast as Lewis, but you know what? If he could win a percentage of the races that Lewis didn't, where was the risk? He had nothing to lose. Plus, the car was superior. With Toto's stamp of approval, Valtteri was going to get his chance. We were all going to find out how good he was. So here we are, 4 years later. Where do we stand on Valtteri Bottas? Low drama? Check. Fast? Check. Faster than Lewis? No. Battled Lewis? Sporadically. Not like Nico. Since joining Mercedes, Valtteri has won 9 times, to Lewis's 43. So again, sounds like he's done that pretty well. Only problem is Max Verstappen has won 11 times, in a car that's never been considered on the pace of the Mercedes. So now Toto is sitting there thinking, Lewis is near the end. Is Valtteri Bottas the guy that I want taking Mercedes into the future to battle against Max Verstappen and the Red Bull? It seems like every time Toto Wolff reaches out to the universe with these types of questions, he gets answers. And one of those answers was George Russell. George was signed as a test and reserve driver for Mercedes-AMG Motorsport in 2017. We first saw George driving Sergio Perez's Force India at Interlagos in 2017 when he was able to drive in Free Practice 1. In 2018, he dominated, winning the F2 title, beating the likes of Lando Norris, Nicholas Latifi, Alexander Albon, and many other highly regarded drivers. His performance was rewarded, and he was given the drive at Williams in 2018. Mercedes had done their part finding him a spot on the grid. Now it was up to George. Although not in a competitive car, Mercedes basically said to him, learn your craft, learn the circuits, and be ready when a seat at the big team becomes available. George, during his stint at Williams, it must be said, has done all those things. He's completely dominated teammates. He's gotten into Q2 when that car had no business being there. He's totally overperformed. He's been pragmatic, he's been well-spoken, and he's been drama-free. I think it speaks a lot about his character that, despite his young age, he's already been voted the head of the Grand Prix Drivers Association by his peers. Safe to say we all agree. George Russell is the total package. In fact, Mercedes obviously think highly enough about him that unfortunately last year when Lewis Hamilton contracted COVID, they chose to see what Russell could do in that car instead of calling upon their reserve driver, Stoffel Van Dorn. With only days to prepare him for the race, it was expected that Valtteri Bottas would take the reins and go for the win. Most of their efforts were on getting George fit properly in the car and getting him used to the different systems that Mercedes use. If he could run a clean race and provide a little bit of backup for Valtteri and get some points for the team, it would have been a huge success. I don't think anybody expected what happened next.
87 laps ahead of us. It's lights out and away we go. Russell does get away well, as does Max Verstappen, and Valtteri Bottas has got his teammate right alongside him already. Sergio Perez is trying to challenge as George Russell goes into the first turn, and George Russell takes the lead of the Sakhir Grand Prix. Valtteri Bottas is second and gets all out of shape coming out of turn 2. That's going to give Perez and Verstappen all the impetus they need. As it's 3 cars going wheel to wheel, there's a spin right at the back. Could be Kimi Raikkonen in the Alfa Romeo. Look up there as Perez is caught by Charles Leclerc, and there's 3 cars gone off at turn 4, and we've already got high drama here on the opening lap, and it's Max Verstappen who was the third of those cars. He is out of the race on the first lap.
Full safety car deployed.
And George Russell, we wondered how he'd manage the start. He absolutely aced it.
Absolutely brilliant. Perfect.
Every F1 fan watching was on the edge of their seats, cheering. Here was this young race car driver who had toiled at the back in an inferior car, watching people he defeated in F2 have success, score podiums, collect points. He'd done it. He'd aced the start, and despite starting on the dirty side, he beat Valtteri into turn 1. He immediately pulled away from the pack, as Valtteri struggled to heat up his tires. But it was undeniable. George Russell was good enough to drive for Mercedes, and he was very comfortable leading a race. Lap after lap, and Valtteri had no answer, as George continued to pull away. And it wasn't until the first set of pit stops where chaos ensued. George came in for his stop, and the team, due to a radio malfunction in the garage, got the tires mixed up, and he was sent out on a mixed set. Bottas was close behind, and as he pitted, the team realized that the tires were mixed up, and they ended up sending him back out on the very same used set that he came in with. Then, things went from bad to worse, as George was informed that he had a mixed set on the car and had to pit immediately. This placed him behind Valtteri Bottas, who obviously was on the used set of tires, and George was on fresh boots. Mercedes knew their best chance was to send George as hard as he could go, and Valtteri, well, his race was already compromised, and he was just supposed to get to the end. With no official team orders in place, we all once again got to the edge of our seats and started cheering.
Pierre Gasly, Lando Norris really going for it in 11th, but can't make a move yet. Raikkonen gets ahead of Kevin Magnussen. There goes George Russell, and Valtteri Bottas goes a little bit wider through turn 4. Russell's now going to have a go at him on this twisty section of the track, the middle section. He's got the inside line at turn 7, and he goes past his teammate. George Russell overtakes Valtteri Bottas. That was committed, it was brave, it was brilliant.
Game on, that was handy for Mercedes-Benz, to be honest. Now he can, I think, on those tyres, he can get after the 3 ahead of him. Can George Russell? He punished Bottas for that mistake. And has he got the speed now?
George Russell, maybe he just wants to get to the finish a little bit quicker because his foot's hurting him a bit. But when he gets his foot down and he makes up his mind to go for it, this is just brilliant. Wow.
How's that for your first race for Mercedes-Benz? But remembering, of course, that Bottas's tyres are of an unknown vintage. We think they're 21 laps old.
I love that call from Martin Brundle. His tires are of an unknown vintage. The general consensus was, there was no doubt that had it not been for the pit stop issues, George Russell would have won this race, and he would have won it handily. This raised a lot of questions, especially with all 3 drivers, Valtteri, Sir Lewis, and George. All 3 of their contracts are up at the end of 2021. After Sakhir, it's pretty safe to say that Bottas' momentum was going the other way. It had turned a complete 180. People have already seen him now. For 4 years, this being his 5th, Bottas has certainly checked a lot of boxes for Mercedes. But has he for the fans? I think they've seen enough. Whether or not you were a Russell fan or whether or not you were a Williams fan before that race in Sakhir, one thing is for sure, you were cheering. You were cheering because this was great racing. He was the underdog. And Toto was now faced with some very hard decisions to make. On one hand, you have 7-time, potentially 8-time world driving champion, Sir Lewis Hamilton. At the time of this podcast, it's actually unclear what Lewis's plans are. There's talk that he potentially might retire. There's a talk that he might sign an extension on with the team, or perhaps he might even leave the team. And as I predicted before, if he does leave Mercedes, I'd expect him to end up at Aston Martin. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So far, Valtteri's done everything they've asked him to, except outperform George Russell and Sakhir. And George, on the other hand, has exceeded all expectations at Williams. And does anyone think it's a good idea for F1 to have George Russell continue his career at the back of the pack? I don't think so. It's my opinion that Toto Wolff has made his mind up. And although it hasn't gone public yet, I believe that George Russell has put ink to paper for Mercedes for 2022. That only leaves 1 seat left. Now again, I cannot deny or confirm Lewis Hamilton's plans for 2022. But don't forget, we also have Esteban Ocon waiting in the wings. And if he performs well against Fernando Alonso this year, well, he has age on his side, and he's patiently been waiting just like George. And then again, the one guy I've never connected to Mercedes, but his talent is just undeniable, is Pierre Gasly, who we all think obviously has hit a dead end in the Red Bull family. If a team like Alpine can't make room for Gasly, I think it would be wise for Mercedes to look in that direction as well. Let's just ask ourselves here. If every driver's contract was up at the end of this year, and there was only 1 seat available left at Mercedes, let's go through the list. Would you rather have Charles Leclerc or Valtteri Bottas? Would you rather have Carlos Sainz or Valtteri Bottas? Would you rather have Max? Would you rather have Sergio? What about Gasly, Ocon, Alonso, Tsunoda, Russell, Stroll, Vettel, Geez, Lando? Ricciardo? How far do we have to go back before we actually believe Bottas can beat somebody that's currently on the grid? I don't know. You tell me. I look forward to your comments below. But I think this also explains why Valtteri was so completely out of it in Imola and was nowhere near the pace. If I were a gambling man, and I'm not, I would say that Valtteri Bottas has actually been informed by Mercedes that he will not be retained next year. This would certainly explain his driving performance in Imola. All we have to do is take a look back to last year at Sebastian Vettel, who was told before the season even started that he would not be retained by Ferrari. And look how that went. There is absolutely no way you can drive a modern Formula One car in those horrific conditions without a clear mind, and Valtteri looked like he had a lot on his mind. This goes back to my original 3 words: honor, code, loyalty. And let's look at it from Toto's perspective. His loyalty lies with the team, Mercedes. He's an honorable man and would have told Valtteri up front and given him enough time to look for another place on the grid. And as far as code goes, perhaps Valtteri feels like the code is broken. Now, after 5 years with the team and Valtteri only 31, perhaps he was expecting to be the senior driver going forward. And now, he won't be. In fact, I don't even think there's a seat on the grid for Valtteri Bottas. I would add that to the mix. That would make his driving understandable in Imola. Going into Imola, everybody expected the Red Bull to not only secure pole, but also win the race. That's why it was such a big surprise when Lewis was able to manage P1. Lewis drove faultlessly, and was certainly aided by both Red Bulls making errors on their final laps. But this didn't explain why Valtteri Bottas was back in P8, with no apparent mechanical issues. Things got worse on race day, though, for Valtteri. First off, the race started off in wet conditions. Now, Valtteri, to my memory, has never been known as somebody who's a wet weather specialist. His driving in the wet in Imola certainly didn't do anything to enhance that reputation. Despite some off-track excursions by those around him and in front of him, Valtteri had actually lost 2 positions and was running in P10. Lewis, at the time, was still in touch with the leader, despite the fact he had front wing damage and was missing an M plate. After the race, I have since gone in and watched Valtteri's laps on my F1 TV app, and I was watching him specifically on board, listening to him speak to his engineer. Valtteri continued to complain that he couldn't build up any temperature in his tires. I could actually hear him every time he was exiting the corners. He was lighting up the rear tires, trying to look for some temperature. Not only was Valtteri losing ground to Lance Stroll, who started the race with his brakes on fire, then was struggling with gearbox issues and fogging issues with his visor and could not see. But in addition, in his rearview mirrors were George Russell and Kimi Raikkonen, who were fast approaching. The team, finally exasperated with his pace, sent this message.
Currently losing a lot of time behind Stroll.
Come on, Valtteri.
Despite Toto in his ear, Bottas' pace didn't improve, and he only passed Stroll when Stroll pitted first. Mercedes had left Bottas out there quite a long time because he was struggling with the wet conditions. I mean, if he didn't have any pace on the inters, he was certainly not going to have any pace on the slicks. Finally, the team couldn't wait any longer, and they brought him in. Upon pit exit, he was advised that the end of the pit lane was extremely slippery. I had heard a number of engineers say the same thing to their drivers. That information is important, so remember that. Despite the conditions improving, Valtteri was now having great troubles heating up the slicks. As Formula One world champion Jacques Villeneuve observed, his pace was so terrible out of the corners, he simply just wasn't fast enough. This is also very important to remember. No doubt that Valtteri now was battling himself. I guarantee his grip on the steering wheel got a little tighter as his pace continued to fade. And then, this.
So, car behind Stroll is Verstappen, the race leader, who will get blue flags. You have blue flags for Verstappen.
Valtteri's only hope at this point was that he could heat up the tires, and with the track improving, hopefully the Mercedes would be much better in drier conditions, and so would he. Unfortunately for Valtteri, he didn't do that. And before the race was half done, the leader Max Verstappen was lapping him, and his teammate Sir Lewis Hamilton was close behind.
DRS has been enabled. So Lewis behind, car behind. Don't make you lose any time. And you're racing Russell. So Lewis, gravel trap at turn 7.
That's a lot of information to digest. But for one moment, let's put ourselves in Valtteri's shoes. Here he is, been lapped by Max Verstappen, is about to be lapped by his teammate, followed by George Russell in the Williams. Then he's told that Lewis has gone off, and he must assume that he's out of the race. Opportunity had presented itself to Valtteri in this race to be the savior for the team, and yet again, he dropped the ball. There is no doubt that Valtteri's mind was now spinning. The criticism that he took in Sakhir and how he was outperformed by George, that stuck. That hurt. That lingers on like scar tissue just wearing away at you. And imagine if he was criticized in Sakhir when George was defeating him in his sister Mercedes. Imagine what it would be like now if George was to do it in a Williams. It was now decision time for Valtteri. He knew that Russell was continuing to gain, and Valtteri had absolutely no grip coming out of corners. It was at this point that two very important things occurred. Have you figured it out yet?
Shit! This is too fucking big for you, you know that? This is... Who did the president? Who killed Kennedy? Fuck, man! It's a mystery! It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma! The fucking shooters don't even know, don't you get it? Fuck, man!
Need a few more clues? Alright, here you go. There's absolutely no question that Bottas knew Russell was gaining on him, and he also knew that Russell was now in the DRS zone.
Russell half a second behind.
The two key factors that put Valtteri in a very interesting position were the fact that he had no traction coming out of the corner, and also they had extended the DRS zone there, which meant that Russell would actually catch him just before the kink, and that is not how it was designed to work at Imola. To prove that point, George was inquiring about his front brakes, expecting to catch Valtteri after the kink, and have to outbrake him going into turn 1.
How are front brakes?
It's then that he's notified by his race engineer that he's going much faster than Bottas. And at no point did I hear him say, "You are not allowed to pass." In fact, it sounded like he wanted him to pass. George had a great exit out of the final turn and quickly gained on Bottas and estimated his speed by the time they reached the kink at 220 miles an hour. At that rate of speed, George is traveling 322 feet per second. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I went on board watching Bottas every single lap that he drove that race. And only twice did he take that line. And it was while he was on the inter tires, and he was wandering out looking for some water to cool them off. Now, I raise this question to you. Did Bottas move? Because in my opinion, he definitely moved. It was subtle, but he moved. And he moved at the kink. And this is what put George's life in jeopardy. George's incredible reactions at that point helped save him from making contact with Valtteri's right rear tire. Had he done that, I think George would have ended up over the fence up in the trees. This could have been a catastrophic accident. Instead, we saw yet again, when George's car snapped to the left, his front left tire hit the halo, potentially saving Valtteri's life. Thankfully, both of them escaped unharmed. And at the end of the day, that is the most important thing. F1, after all, is only a sport. It's not worth lives. We've already lost too many. But avoiding that tire was only the first of his problems, because now the car was out of balance, and he was moving to the right. Now I ask this question to you. If every single lap he was hugging that left curb going around the kink, and it was the pit exit that was beginning to dry, except for the right-hand side of it where nobody had any business being there anyways, why did Bottas move? When you go back and watch that move again, Valtteri is crossing the pit exit line well before the end of it. Now, considering the dryer line was also to the left, and this is at a point during the race when the pits are very active, the weather conditions are ever-changing, this posed a serious safety risk in my opinion. And I would be surprised if there wasn't a rule you weren't allowed to cross the pit exit line at that point. And this also led George to believe that he could make the pass on the outside and trust Valtteri. He just didn't expect him to move. The following is the Incar audio from George Russell's perspective. Warning, I have not edited this footage. I needed to let it stand, to grasp the moment. This clip contains explicit language, and is terrifying to listen to. It was even worse to watch. Take note of the fact that George does not lift, and listen to the tone in his engineer's voice as he agrees with his statement.
What the fuck was he doing? Honestly. Is he a fucking prick or what?
Yeah, P0, P0.
George had no chance. And here's another question I pose to you. Had Valtteri made that move a little bit earlier, he would have left a gap on the left-hand side. Which side then do you think George would have chose? In my opinion, George would have chose the inside. And this is specifically why Valtteri chose to drift out to the right. Do I think he intended to crash into George? No, I don't. I think he intended George to back out of it. But hey, you know what they say about going for a gap.
And you should know that by being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. By being a racing driver means you are racing with other people. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. Because we are competing. We are competing to win. And the main motivation to all of us is to compete for a victory. It's not to come third, fourth, fifth, or sixth. When there is a gap, it's designed for being in a competition at a very high level, with cars going so close that as they go today, with the same horsepower, with the same level of grip, with the same load aerodynamic. You all know, with the different circuits where it's very difficult for overtaking because the circuits are designed not in appropriate manner for overtaking maneuvers, you either commit yourself as a professional racing driver that is designed to win races, or you come second, or you come third, or you come fifth. And I'm not designed to come third, fourth, or fifth. I race to win, as long as I feel it's possible. Sometimes you get it wrong, sure. It's impossible to get it right all the time. But I race designed to win.
Toto Wolff after the race stated, George should never have launched this maneuver, but then quickly followed it up with this.
Absolutely not necessary, but it takes two to tango. And from where I can understand from each driver's perspective that it wasn't his fault, but if you look at it from a global perspective, from where we sit at Mercedes, it's something that shouldn't be happening. I think both of them think that they are not to blame, and I will need to make the point that this is not a clear cut for me. The accident, yeah. It was quite a move on the DRS there, but I guess when a driver doesn't go for the gang up.
Looks to me like Valtteri just turned the tables and put Toto on the hot seat. Funny how Toto didn't seem to mind it when Lewis passed Lando in the exact same place. Or perhaps he didn't seem to mind it because Lando didn't cross the white line, and Valtteri did. Make no doubt about it, this was Toto Wolff trying to keep together the fragile psyche right now of Valtteri Bottas so that he and Lewis Hamilton can put the fight to Red Bull. But on the other hand, he's also letting George know that he is the future of Mercedes. Now, whether he joins Lewis with the team next year or not, perhaps Lewis retires and moves on, but make no doubt about it, George Russell will be in the Mercedes in 2022, and that is exactly why Valtteri Bottas did this. Still not convinced? Well, then I ask you this one last question. With the track drying and Valtteri on slicks, it was only a matter of time before he got the tires up to temperature. Had Valtteri been thinking clearly, he would have known this. He would have known that, you know what, I'm just going to let George go. Because in a few laps, I'm going to eat him up, and I'm going to make my way through the field. Valtteri didn't do that. That's why Valtteri's never beaten Lewis, and that's why Lewis drove all the way back up to second place. Valtteri's late move on George was a statement. It was a statement to everyone involved.
How about that? Fuck yeah! To whom it may concern, fuck you.
Now back to those three words: honor, code, loyalty. Valtteri's been honorable to Mercedes. He broke the code against George. And now with prospects looking bleak for the 2022 season, after 4 years of being with the team, and now this being his 5th, I guess we're now calling it Valtteri Bottas 5.0. The knock on Bottas is that he's always been too nice. He hasn't had that killer instinct. In my opinion, Valtteri Bottas 5.0 is very different. And the move he pulled on George was ruthless. It was sly, and it was ruthless. The difference was, he had options, and he decided to do it. We finally now have Valtteri Bottas, the racer, who's racing for his life, racing for his career. Valtteri Bottas 5.0 is officially here, and I only wonder if anyone else on the grid even noticed. I hope you enjoyed this podcast today. My name is Matthew Kane. If you don't already follow me on social media, please do. My website is thedirtyrf1.com, and I am the Dirty Air F1 podcast on YouTube and Instagram, and of course on Twitter, dirty_F1. When it comes to social media, I've really directed most of my attention towards Twitter, and I got to say to all my new followers on Twitter, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone's patience with regards to part 2. Like I said, there were a lot of angles I wanted to cover on this one, and I hope I did a good job, and I hope it was worth the wait. I've really gotten a lot out of your messages of encouragement, the tips and tricks you guys have shared with me, and I want to give a special shout out to @JackLikesF1. Jack sent me a message on Twitter while I was on the home stretch of this thing, well, when I thought I was on the home stretch of this thing, and it just gave me a really, really good laugh, and it kind of inspired me to keep going and finish it off. So, to Jack, thanks so much, buddy. I really appreciated it. And to the rest of my F1 family, till next time, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Up ahead. There's 20 seconds to Verstappen. Understood. He's too quick for me.
Gap to Leclerc 1.7, Sainz 3.